Hello, my name is Caleb Warner. I'm 38 years old, and I work as an auto technician in a small garage just outside of Valdosta, Georgia. My life, if I had to describe it, is like a quiet creek that runs behind forgotten farmland. Steady, unremarkable, but carrying more weight than anyone bothers to notice. I'm not the kind of person who enjoys talking about himself, but since you're here, I'll try to help you understand who I am and why I'm standing in this funeral home, clutching a folded program with my father's face on it, my heart heavy with grief and something else I can't quite name. The Warner family has worked the same red clay soil in rural Georgia for 4 generations. My great-grandfather cleared the land with his bare hands, my grandfather expanded it during the Depression, and my father, Tom, turned it into one of the most respected farms in the county. Growing up, I always assumed I'd inherit that legacy, not because I was entitled to it, but because it seemed as natural as the seasons changing. The land was in our blood, and I was the only son. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But life has a way of teaching you that assumptions are dangerous things. My father died on a Tuesday morning in October, his heart giving out while he was checking on the cattle. The funeral was held 3 days later at Morningside Baptist, the same church where he'd been baptized 67 years ago. The pews were packed with farmers, neighbors, and folks from town who remembered Tom Warner as a fair man who kept his word and never asked for what he couldn't earn. I sat in the front row, my hands folded in my lap, trying to ignore the whispers behind me. To my left sat Ellie, my ex-wife, her blonde hair pinned back in that careful way she'd always worn to important events. Next to her was Noah, her 17-year-old son from her first marriage, my former stepson, though we hadn't spoken much since the divorce 3 years ago. The service was simple, the way my father would have wanted it. Pastor McKenzie spoke about Tom's dedication to the land and his quiet generosity to neighbors in need. But all I could think about was the conversation we'd never had, the apology I'd never given, and the bridge between us that had crumbled the day I'd walked away from the farm to marry Ellie. After the burial, we gathered at Amelia Bennett's law office on Main Street. Amelia had been the family lawyer for 20 years, a sharp woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd handled my parents' affairs, my divorce, and now, apparently, my father's final wishes. "Before we begin," Amelia said, adjusting her reading glasses, "I want you all to know that Tom spent considerable time on this will. Every decision was deliberate." I nodded, expecting to hear about the farm being divided, maybe some conditions about keeping the land in the family. Ellie shifted in her chair beside me. Noah, slouched in his seat with that teenage indifference he'd perfected, barely looked up from his phone. Amelia cleared her throat and began to read. "I, Thomas James Warner, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my entire estate, including the family farm, all buildings, equipment, livestock, and financial assets, to Noah Pierce, with the hope that he will honor the land as it has honored our family." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, felt the room tilt slightly to one side. Noah's head snapped up, his eyes wide with surprise. Ellie's hand flew to her mouth. "There must be some mistake," I said quietly. Amelia's expression was carefully neutral. "There's no mistake, Caleb. The will is clear and legally binding." I looked at Noah, who was staring at me with something I couldn't quite read. Surprise, yes, but also a hint of satisfaction that cut deeper than the disinheritance itself. This 17-year-old kid, who'd lived in our house for barely 3 years before the divorce, who'd never shown any interest in farming, who'd spent most of our time together treating me like an inconvenience. He was now the owner of everything my family had built. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. "I see." "Caleb," Ellie started, but I held up my hand. "Congratulations, Noah," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I hope you'll take good care of the place." I walked out of that office and into the Georgia afternoon, my father's final rejection echoing in my head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. Behind me, I heard Ellie calling my name, but I didn't turn around. I just kept walking, past the courthouse square, past the diner where my father used to take me for breakfast on Saturdays, past all the familiar landmarks of a life that no longer belonged to me. What I didn't know then was that sometimes the loudest truths are hidden in the quietest places, and that my father's real will was waiting for me in the last place I'd think to look. 3 days after the will reading, I found myself driving down the familiar dirt road that led to the Warner farm, my old blue heeler named Blue sitting beside me in the passenger seat. I'd told myself I was coming to say goodbye, to walk through the house one last time before Noah took possession, but deep down I knew I was searching for something, some explanation, some sign that my father hadn't really meant to cut me out of his life so completely. The farmhouse looked smaller than I remembered, its white paint peeling in places, the front porch sagging slightly under the weight of too many Georgia summers. Blue jumped out of the truck before I'd even turned off the engine, his tail wagging as he trotted toward the barn where he'd spent countless hours as a puppy, chasing mice and sleeping in the hay. I walked through the house slowly, my boots creaking on the hardwood floors my great-grandfather had laid by hand. Every room held memories. The kitchen where my mother had taught me to make biscuits, the living room where my father and I had watched baseball games in comfortable silence, the small bedroom under the eaves where I dreamed of someday running this place myself. But it was Blue's sharp barking from the barn that pulled me from my nostalgia. I found him pawing at a section of floorboards near the old milking stalls, whining in that particular way he had when he'd discovered something important. The boards looked different somehow, newer than the rest, though still weathered enough to blend in. I knelt down and pressed against the planks. One of them gave slightly under the pressure, and when I pried it up with my pocket knife, I found a small compartment underneath. Inside was a sealed envelope, with my name written in my father's careful handwriting, and beneath it, wrapped in oiled cloth, an antique pistol that looked like it belonged in a museum. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper with just a few lines. "Son, if you're reading this, then you found what I hoped you would. The truth is buried deeper than most folks would think to look. The key is with Mrs. Holloway. She'll know what to do. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you face to face. Your father." I sat back on my heels, staring at the letter, my mind racing. Mrs. Laverne Holloway lived about a mile down the road, had been our neighbor for as long as I could remember. But what truth was my father talking about? And why hide it like this? Blue nudged my hand with his wet nose, his brown eyes looking up at me with that patient intelligence that had always made him seem more human than dog. For the first time since the will reading, I felt a spark of something other than grief and confusion. Maybe my father's story wasn't over after all. Mrs. Laverne Holloway was sitting on her front porch when I pulled up, as if she'd been expecting me. At 83, she was still sharp as a tack, with silver hair pinned back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She'd known my family longer than anyone still living, and if there were secrets buried on Warner land, she'd know about them. "Caleb Warner," she called out as Blue, and I walked up her gravel path. "I wondered when you'd come calling. Your daddy always said you were the curious type, just took you a while to work up to it." I pulled the letter and the old pistol from my jacket, setting them carefully on the small table between her rocking chairs. Her eyes widened as she examined the weapon, turning it over in her weathered hands like she was greeting an old friend. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "I haven't seen this in 40 years. Your grandfather showed it to me once, said it belonged to a Confederate soldier who deserted right here on this very land back in 1863. "What does this have to do with my father's will?" I asked, settling into the chair beside her. Mrs. Holloway was quiet for a long moment, rocking slowly as she gathered her thoughts. "Your daddy came to see me about 6 months ago, right after he got diagnosed with that heart condition. He was worried, Caleb. Worried about what would happen to the land, worried about secrets that had been kept too long." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "There's a room under that old barn of yours, boy. Been sealed up since your great-grandfather's time. Story goes that during the Civil War, folks used to hide things down there. Deserters, runaway slaves, valuables. Your family's been guardians of that history for generations." My heart began to race. "Are you saying there's another will down there?" "I'm saying your daddy was protecting more than just farmland. He left that boy the surface, Caleb, but the real inheritance, the one that matters, that's still waiting for someone brave enough to dig for it." She handed me a small brass key that had been hidden in the folds of her apron. "This opens what needs opening, but I'll warn you, once you start digging up the past, there's no telling what you'll find." I took the key, feeling its weight in my palm. It was warm from her touch and seemed to pulse with possibility. Blue whined softly at my feet, as if he could sense the importance of this moment. "Mrs. Holloway," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "what exactly am I looking for down there?" Her smile was sad but determined. "The truth, honey. Just the truth. And maybe, if you're lucky, the chance to set things right." That night, I drove back to the farm with a shovel in my truck bed and hope flickering in my chest for the first time in days. The barn waited in the darkness, keeping its secrets for one more night. I returned to the barn at midnight, when the Georgia countryside was silent except for the distant sound of bullfrogs singing from the creek. Blue stayed close to my side as I pried up more floorboards, following the pattern of newer wood until I found what I was looking for, a trap door hidden beneath decades of hay and dust. The brass key Mrs. Holloway had given me fit perfectly into a small lock embedded in the wood. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from another century, revealing narrow wooden steps leading down into darkness. I clicked on my flashlight and descended carefully, Blue's claws clicking on the steps behind me. The underground room was larger than I'd expected, carved directly from the red clay soil and reinforced with hand-hewn timbers. Against one wall sat several wooden crates, their contents protected by oiled canvas. But it was the metal lockbox in the center of the room that made my heart race. It was newer than everything else, maybe 20 years old, with my father's initials carved into the lid. Inside the box, I found a manila envelope marked Last Will and Testament, Thomas James Warner, dated just 3 months before his death. Beneath it was an old camcorder and a videotape labeled, "For Caleb." My hands shook as I read the real will. Everything. The farm, the house, the equipment, even the historical artifacts in this room, was left to me. Noah was mentioned too, but only as a beneficiary of a trust fund my father had quietly established, enough to pay for college and give him a good start in life. But it was the videotape that broke my heart. I found an old TV with a built-in VCR in one of the crates, and when I played the tape, my father's face appeared on the grainy screen, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Son," his recorded voice said, "if you're watching this, then you found what I hoped you would. I know I wasn't the father you deserved. I was too proud, too stubborn to say I was wrong when you left. But you were never out of my heart, not for a single day." He paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I left the other will with Amelia because I needed to know you'd fight for this place. Not because you felt entitled to it, but because you understood what it meant. This land holds stories, Caleb. Stories of people who struggled and survived, who found freedom and lost it, who built something lasting with their bare hands. I needed to know you'd be strong enough to carry that forward." The tape ended with him looking directly into the camera. "I love you, son. I always have. Now go make this right." I sat in that underground room for a long time, surrounded by the weight of history and my father's love, finally understanding that his greatest gift wasn't the land itself. It was the chance to prove I was worthy of it. The next morning, I walked into Amelia Bennett's office with the real will tucked under my arm and a fire in my belly I hadn't felt in years. She looked up from her desk as I entered, and something in her expression told me she'd been expecting this moment. "You found it," she said quietly, not even glancing at the documents I placed on her desk. "You knew. It wasn't a question." The pieces were falling into place now. Her careful neutrality during the will reading, the way she'd avoided my eyes afterward, the deliberate phrasing she'd used. "You knew about this will all along." Amelia removed her reading glasses and rubbed her temples. Tom brought it to me 3 months before he died. He also brought me the other one, the one that named Noah as heir. He told me to read the Noah will first, and only produce this one if you came looking for it. Why? The word came out sharper than I intended. Because he wanted to know what kind of man you'd become, she said, meeting my eyes for the first time. Tom was worried that you'd given up on yourself after the divorce, that you'd lost the fight that made you his son. He needed to see if you still had the backbone to stand up for what was right. I felt anger rising in my chest. So this was all some kind of test. You let me walk out of here thinking my father had rejected me. Let Noah believe he'd inherited a fortune, all because my father wanted to play games. It wasn't a game, Caleb. Amelia's voice was firm. Tom was protecting something bigger than just a farm. He showed me what's in that underground room. The artifacts, the historical documents, the stories of people who lived and died on that land. He needed to know you'd fight not just for yourself, but for all of it. She leaned forward, her expression earnest. I've known your family for 20 years. I watched you grow up on that farm, saw how you loved the land, even when you couldn't love yourself. But I also saw you walk away without a fight, when things got hard. Tom needed to know that man was gone. I stared at her for a long moment, processing the betrayal and the twisted logic behind it. Part of me wanted to be furious, but another part, the part that had felt something shift inside me when I found that hidden room, understood. What happens now? I asked. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Now we file this will with the court and make things right, she said, picking up her phone. But Caleb, Noah isn't going to take this well, and Ellie, she paused. There are things you don't know about why she pushed Tom to include Noah in the first will, things that might surprise you. I thought about the 17-year-old kid who'd looked so smug in her office just days ago, and I felt my first pang of sympathy for him. He was about to learn that everything he thought he knew about his place in the world was wrong. Then we'd better get started, I said. The confrontation came 2 days later when I was back at the farm, measuring the underground room for the Historical Preservation Society. I heard car doors slamming in the driveway and looked up to see Ellie's white sedan, with Noah climbing out of the passenger seat, his face red with anger. "You son of a bitch!" Noah shouted as he stormed into the barn, Ellie hurrying behind him. "You couldn't stand that I got something you wanted, so you made up some fake will to steal it back." I stood up slowly, brushing dirt from my knees. At 17, Noah was nearly as tall as me now, but there was still something fragile in his anger, something that reminded me of a wounded animal lashing out. "It's not fake, Noah," I said quietly. "Your mother knows that." Noah spun to look at Ellie, who was standing in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself. "Mom?" "I'm sorry, honey," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew there might be another will. I encouraged Tom to put you in the first one, because I thought Caleb would never fight for anything. I thought he'd just accept it and walk away." The hurt in Noah's eyes was devastating to watch. "So you knew this would happen? You knew I'd lose everything?" "I thought you deserved something," Ellie said, tears starting to fall. "You spent 3 years in that house with us, and when Caleb and I divorced, you lost the only stable father figure you'd ever had. I wanted Tom to see you as family, too." For a moment I saw past Noah's anger to the scared kid underneath. He'd been bounced between homes, never quite belonging anywhere, and just when he thought he'd found his place, it was being taken away again. "You never wanted me around," Noah said, turning back to me. "You made that clear every day I lived in your house, and now you want to act like the victim?" His words hit home because they weren't entirely wrong. I had resented Noah's presence, had seen him as a reminder of Ellie's past, had never really tried to be the stepfather he needed. "You're right," I said, and the admission seemed to surprise all three of us. "I wasn't fair to you. I was so wrapped up in my own problems that I never gave you a real chance. But this isn't about revenge, Noah. This is about something bigger than either of us." I gestured to the hidden room behind me. "This place holds history that matters. My father trusted me to protect it, but that doesn't mean you have to disappear from the story." Noah's anger faltered for a moment, replaced by confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about finding a way forward that doesn't leave anyone behind," I said. "But first we need to sort out the legal mess we're all in." The barn fell silent except for the sound of Ellie crying softly. Blue, who had been watching from the corner, padded over and sat between Noah and me, as if trying to bridge the gap that years of misunderstanding had created. For the first time since this all began, I felt like we might be able to find our way home. That evening, Mrs. Holloway joined me in the underground room, her eyes bright with curiosity as we carefully examined the artifacts my father had preserved. The wooden crates contained more than I'd initially realized: Civil War-era buttons, belt buckles, a Confederate officer's sword, and Union Army medical supplies. But it was the leather-bound journal, wrapped in oiled cloth, that stopped us both in our tracks. "Lord have mercy," Mrs. Holloway whispered as I opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed and fragile, but the ink was still legible. "That's Samuel's handwriting." "Samuel?" "Samuel Freeman. He was a freed slave who worked on this land during Reconstruction. My grandmother used to tell stories about him. Said he was the one who helped build the tunnel system under the barn, helped runaway slaves and Confederate deserters alike." I read aloud from the journal's first page. "June 15, 1863. Today we hid 3 more souls in the room beneath the Warner barn. Master Warner says the war has made brothers of enemies and enemies of brothers. Down here, in the darkness, we are all just people trying to survive." The entries painted a picture of the Warner farm as a way station on an underground railroad that served both runaway slaves heading north and Confederate deserters fleeing south. My great-great-grandfather had risked everything to help people find freedom, regardless of which side of the war they'd been on. "Your family's been keeping this secret for over 150 years, Mrs. Holloway said, her voice filled with awe. "This changes everything we know about the local history." I thought about Noah, about the anger in his eyes when he'd accused me of stealing his inheritance. He couldn't understand the weight of what we'd discovered down here, couldn't see that this was bigger than property or money. "Mrs. Holloway," I said, closing the journal carefully, "what would you do with something like this?" She was quiet for a long moment, running her weathered fingers along the edge of one of the wooden crates. "I'd make sure the story got told right. These people, Samuel, the runaways, the deserters, your ancestors who risked everything to help them, they deserve to be remembered." I nodded, feeling the responsibility settle on my shoulders like a familiar weight. The Historical Society needs to see this. Maybe the university, too. This could become a teaching site, a place where people can learn about the real history of this area. "And Noah?" she asked gently. I thought about the hurt in his eyes, about Ellie's tears, about the family that had been fractured by secrets and misunderstandings. Noah deserves to be part of this story, too. He may not be a Warner by blood, but he lived in that house, walked this land. If we're going to honor the people who found refuge here, maybe we need to start by offering some refuge ourselves. Mrs. Holloway smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Your father would be proud, Caleb. He always said the land would teach you what you needed to know." As we climbed back up into the barn, I felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about reclaiming my inheritance anymore. It was about becoming the kind of man who could carry this legacy forward. The courthouse in Valdosta was packed on the morning of the hearing. Word had spread through the county about the will dispute, and it seemed like half the town had turned out to see how it would end. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Amelia, the real will, and Samuel Freeman's journal spread before us like evidence of a truth too long buried. Across the aisle, Noah sat with his court-appointed lawyer, a young man who looked overwhelmed by the historical significance of what we'd uncovered. Ellie sat in the gallery behind him, her face pale but determined. Judge Harrison, a silver-haired man who'd known my father since they were boys, called the court to order. "This is an unusual case," he began, "involving not just property rights but questions of family, intention, and historical preservation." Amelia presented our evidence methodically: the second will, the video testimony from my father, photographs of the underground room and its contents. When she played the tape of my father explaining his reasoning, I saw Noah's shoulders tense, saw him wipe his eyes when no one was looking. "Your Honor," Noah's lawyer argued, "my client has been living under the assumption that he was the rightful heir. To overturn that now, based on a hidden will, seems questionable at best." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. Warner, I have a question for you. What exactly do you want here? Legal ownership of the property, or something else?" I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "Your Honor, I want to honor my father's real wishes and the history of this land, but I also want to do something my family hasn't been good at. I want to heal instead of divide." I turned to look at Noah. "This farm has been a place of refuge for over a century. People came there when they had nowhere else to go, when they needed someone to see their worth beyond their circumstances. I think it's time we remembered that tradition." Judge Harrison's eyebrows rose. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing that we turn the Warner Farm into a historical and educational center, a place where the stories of Samuel Freeman and the Underground Railroad can be told. A place where young people like Noah can learn about courage and compassion and maybe find their own place in that story." The courtroom was silent for a long moment. I could hear my own heartbeat, could see the confusion and hope warring in Noah's eyes. "And Noah's role in this?" the judge asked. "Partnership," I said simply. "Joint stewardship. He may not be a Warner by blood, but he's connected to this land now, part of its story. I'd rather build something together than tear something apart." Mrs. Holloway, who had been sitting in the front row, stood up and began to clap. One by one, other people in the gallery joined her, until the sound filled the courtroom like thunder. Judge Harrison smiled and raised his gavel. "Case closed." After the hearing, I found Noah sitting alone on the courthouse steps, staring out at the square where farmers used to bring their cotton to market. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by something that looked like exhaustion mixed with confusion. "You didn't have to do that," he said without looking up as I sat down beside him. "Yeah, I did." I watched a mockingbird hop across the grass, remembering how my father used to point out their songs when I was Noah's age. My father was right about one thing. I've spent too much time walking away from fights that mattered. Noah turned to look at me for the first time. "Why? Why offer me half of something that's legally yours?" I thought about how to answer that, about the years of resentment and misunderstanding that had brought us to this moment. Because that land taught me something. Samuel Freeman wrote about how people from different sides found common ground in that underground room. Maybe it's time we learned from that. "I don't know anything about farming," Noah said quietly, "or history. I'm just a 17-year-old kid who thought he'd gotten lucky." "And I'm a 38-year-old man who thought he'd lost everything," I replied. "Looks like we were both wrong." Ellie appeared at the bottom of the steps, her eyes red from crying, but her face peaceful in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Noah, honey, can I talk to you for a minute?" As they spoke quietly a few yards away, I saw her take his hands, saw her shoulders shake as she apologized for the mess she'd helped create. When they came back, Noah's eyes were clearer, like a storm had finally passed. "I owe you an apology," he said to me. "All those years in your house, I was angry at you for not wanting me there, but I never tried to meet you halfway either." "We both have things to be sorry for," I said. "The question is, what we do from here." Noah was quiet for a long moment. Then he surprised me by asking, "That education center you talked about, what would that actually look like?" For the next hour, we sat on those courthouse steps and planned. A visitor center in the old farmhouse, guided tours of the underground room, a youth program where local kids could learn about local history, a place where the stories of courage and compassion could be passed down to the next generation. "There's one more thing," I said as the sun began to set. "My father set up a trust fund for you, enough for college, enough to give you choices about your future. The farm work will always be there if you want it, but you don't have to choose between education and inheritance anymore." Noah's eyes filled with tears. He really thought of me as family? "Yeah," I said, remembering my father's voice on that videotape. "He did. And so do I." That night, for the first time in years, The Warner farm felt like home again. 6 months later, I stood on the front porch of the Warner farmhouse, watching as cars pulled into the gravel parking area we'd carved out near the old tobacco barn. The Warner Legacy Center was officially opening today, and it seemed like half of Georgia had come to see what we'd built. The farmhouse had been restored to its original condition, with Samuel Freeman's journal displayed in a place of honor in what used to be my father's study. The underground room had been made safe for visitors, with proper lighting and climate control to protect the artifacts. But the real pride of the place was the youth education program that Noah had designed. Local high school students could spend a semester learning about local history, archaeology, and historical preservation. "You ready for this?" Noah asked, joining me on the porch. At 18 now, he'd grown into his height, and the angry edge that used to define him had been replaced by something steadier, more purposeful. He'd deferred college for a year to help get the center established, and watching him lead tours of excited school groups had shown me a side of him I'd never suspected. "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, adjusting the microphone that would carry my voice to the crowd gathering on the lawn. Mrs. Holloway sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Behind her, I could see Ellie with her new boyfriend, a kind man who treated Noah like the son he'd never had. Even Amelia was there, looking satisfied with the way things had turned out. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steadier than I'd expected, "welcome to the Warner Legacy Center. My name is Caleb Warner, and this is Noah Pierce, and we're here today to tell you a story about second chances." I talked about my father, about the lessons he'd tried to teach me through his elaborate test. I talked about Samuel Freeman and the Underground Railroad, about the courage it takes to offer refuge to strangers. But mostly, I talked about how inheritance isn't just what we're given, it's what we choose to carry forward. "This land has always been about bringing people together," I said, looking out at the faces in the crowd. "It's been a place where differences could be set aside, where people could find common ground. Today, we're continuing that tradition." Noah stepped up to the microphone. "When I first learned about this place, I thought inheritance was about getting something for nothing. But I've learned that real inheritance is about responsibility. The responsibility to honor the past while building something better for the future." As the crowd applauded, I felt a wet nose nudge my hand. Blue, now gray around the muzzle but still loyal, had wandered up onto the stage. I scratched behind his ears and looked out at the land that had shaped 4 generations of my family. The Warner farm was no longer just ours. It belonged to everyone who walked these paths, learned these stories, and carried this history forward. And for the first time in my life, that felt exactly right. My father had left me everything, just not in the way I had expected. He'd left me a legacy worth fighting for, a family worth healing, and a story worth telling. That, I realized, was inheritance enough for any man. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.